Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horrors of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. When Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for his strident political activism in the apartheid state of South Africa, he was condemned to a tiny cell on Robben Island and forced into hard labor. Amidst the chaos, isolation, and backbreaking turmoil, one poem, entitled Invictus, supposedly helped him through the darkest of days. Written by William Ernest Henley, a man whose leg was amputated due to illness, it has become something of an emblem for the unassailable will of the human spirit. Indomitable, unbreakable, or undefeatable is what Invictus translates from Latin into, and has been adopted by people across the world, eager to celebrate the resilience of the human condition. The connection between games and Invictus are interesting to take note of. When Mandela was released from prison and ascended into political office, he chose not to exact revenge against those who wronged him, but extend the hand towards reconciliation. He famously allowed the South African rugby team to keep their defining identity, and they went on to win the Rugby World Cup for the whole nation. More recently, the Invictus Games are a competition held for wounded, injured, or sick armed service personnel, being the most potent bridge between the quiet heroism exhibited by people who have sacrificed and persevered, and the frivolity of play. Jasper Ewell calls games the art of failure, and in his book of the same name, he claims that games are a strange art form in that they have failure built into its language. Strangely, failure in a game is expected and in fact desired, for reasons he pontificates on through the book. He argues games create a deficiency that they then allow us to resolve, giving us the belief that we can overcome any challenge. Think back not just to the finite lives of Mario or Zelda, but how games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Tetris can't actually be one. The sole objective is to stave off your inevitable death by game's end. The metaphor here seems to be that death is unavoidable, and there is no intrinsic victory to be won, only the meaning you define for yourself. Of course, most of us are having too much fun to read games in this deeply symbolic language, telling a strange meta-narrative about how we are always, much like Pac-Man, consumed by our own appetites. Regardless, in games, we defiantly act out our basic evolutionary impulse to survive, however futile and however meaningless. We don't have to be as cynical as this, though. Thinkers from Joseph Campbell to Carl Jung to modern theorists about the utility of stories have argued that they serve as metaphorical guides about how we ought to act in the face of adversity. Games, by presenting a series of cognitive and dexterous challenges, are in some sense a systemization of this meta-narrative structure, where instead of witnessing it vicariously, we act out the hero for ourselves. Homeric epics from the Iliad to the Odyssey were a part of an ancient Greek's education, getting young people to learn how to be, as it were, in the face of adventure. What better way to teach them than by forcing them to act out the role for themselves? Failure in games just becomes an arbitrary hardship on our way to integrating our psyche, and we do this in games as varied as Zelda to Halo and Mass Effect. However, Ewell also cites Aristotle's theory about tragedy to explain why we love failure in games. In ancient Greece, people would gather to witness the downfall of an individual in a tragic play, who served as a scapegoat for the rest of those bearing witness to it, allowing them to cleanse themselves of the irony of the fates and be thankful for what they have. In games, we are the tragic figure in some sense, forever falling but never quite defeated, acting that cathartic release for ourselves. Death is a chance for us to evaluate our mistakes, respawn, and then act out a new pattern with those misgivings in mind. However, despite the fact that tragedy seems to be built into most games, Ewell argues it is very hard to tell a story around this theme. Can we sell a game as, "Come witness the inevitable downfall of this character," especially when the character is partially you? It seems to directly conflict with the desire to overcome that we the player have, and why gaming has not had its equivalent of Oedipus, Hamlet, or Anna Karenina. Games try to align us with the goals and ambitions of our avatar, which is why we get so many heroic quests in games, but no one willingly wants to precipitate their own downfall. This dissonance can be resolved, I feel, but perhaps it requires we be a little more subversive. Shadow of the Colossus was framed as a quintessential monster-killing quest, and it's only through framing, music, and other storytelling cues that you realize this venture isn't quite as noble as it seems. Of course, it required the player themselves buy into the premise of being a hero, something the game Braid did as well. Metal Gear Solid 5 was the first earnest attempt I know of to sell a game as a tragedy, having been portrayed as Big Boss's descent into madness, and players seemed to love that premise, only to be subverted once more. The first God of War was a fairly coherent Greek tragedy, showing the rise and fall of Kratos due to his unbridled ambition, his Achilles' heel, but again it was sold as a hero's journey in the vein of Odysseus. Spec Ops: The Line might be the best example we have of a tragedy in games, where both Walker's and our ambition to feel like a hero is shown to be a hollow desire that leads to madness, destruction, and death. It was Heart of Darkness in interactive form, but with us as the stars of the show. We also have games that portray tragedy through systems, like how Missile Command tells an anti-nuclear parable by showing how the anxiety inherent in protecting multiple cities will, regardless of your effort, end in doom. Maybe the language of failure in games isn't a tragic story, but a redemptive one. The distinction between the two types of stories is subtle, but extremely consequential. A tragic story features a protagonist who does not learn from their mistakes, and a redemptive one is where there is some degree of moral growth or perseverance. It's like when the Beast in Beauty and the Beast puts aside his selfish desires and lets Belle go, becoming the hero we always hoped he was. Or the stage in the hero's journey entitled The Belly of the Whale, when whichever face our hero exhibits must overcome their lowest point, usually a failure of some kind. Failure is to games what cuts are to cinema in some sense, and despite being jarring in a narrative sense, they are a part of the dynamic of play that creates player engagement. A hero's journey shows growth in character and a show of perseverance in the face of hardship, whilst a redemptive story is about overcoming a specific deficiency from our past. In some bizarre sense, we do all these things in games. There's triumph, there's catharsis, and there's growth. And this is what I mean by Invictus in games. We have some fairly robust game design frameworks to conceptualize these forms of engagement. The aesthetics of play model suggests one of the core drives for play is obstacle and challenge. Nicole Lazaro talks about hard fun in her 4 keys framework, otherwise known as Fiero, and Nassim Taleb recently wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, or How Humans Need Hardship to Actually Develop. In fact, a lot of scholars in developmental psychology suggest that although severe adverse child events are bad, some form of hardship is in fact good. In his book Free to Learn, Peter Gray argues that children learn and develop through play, and evidence ranging from how rats deprived of play end up stunted to how children always emulate the activities of their adults suggests play is a form of practice for adult activities. Thus, to maximize the effectiveness of the simulation, some degree of hardship must be programmed in. Death may be built into games for the same reason play is often dangerous. It prepares us for the inevitable hardship we will experience in our lives. A game that perfectly exemplifies all this is Dark Souls. Marketed with the ominous message, "Prepare to die," the game is a deliberately difficult role-playing game that is as obtuse as it is somber. You will die, and some might give up, but those who persevere are rewarded with a sense of triumph that is practically incomparable. The reason for this is precisely because it is so punishing. It gives you no clear direction, there are very infrequent checkpoints, you lose all the souls you collect when you die, and you only have one opportunity to reclaim them. At one point in the game, after having had enough trouble with single bosses, you are presented with 2 simultaneously, Ornstein and Smo. One is nimble and darts across the playfield, the other lumbering but powerful, and trying to find an opening to attack seems utterly impossible. After innumerable attempts, you will succeed, whether it be by soliciting the aid of others, leveling up, or in the vernacular, getting good. And you reach the proverbial princess who is to reward you for your accomplishment. However, everything is not as it seems. Once more, a heroic redemption in gameplay form is being couched as a tragic descent into chaos in its fiction. The other brilliant thing that Dark Souls does is tie the mechanical aspect of death in games into its narrative. Your death is actually acknowledged by the game, as it is part of a narrative about hollowing and decay, where people's wills are depleted every time you die. The game takes the ludic theme of death, acknowledges it in its fiction, then builds a story around overcoming it. If you go on YouTube right now, You will find innumerable videos on how Dark Souls help people cope with depression, and is it any wonder why? It presents people with a virtually insurmountable challenge, and then shows them how they can overcome it. Cognitive behavioral therapists often recommend people voluntarily confront their anxieties in a safe context, and to escape the trap of negative thoughts by exercising metacognitive control over their will. This is strangely reminiscent of what happens during play. In his book, Children and Play in the Holocaust, George Eisen documents how children created games that incorporated the themes that they saw around them in the horrific circumstances of Nazi death camps. Bringing an action into the magic circle of play allows you to take control of it in some sense, with formal rules and procedures, as opposed to being at the whims of forces outside your control. Maybe I'm just overthinking all of this. Flow theory, pioneered by the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, suggests that a true sense of engagement can only be unlocked if we have a challenge that matches our rising abilities. And maintaining this narrow channel is a design conundrum most developers face. Games always have an escalating sense of pacing and progression, in terms of mechanics or the narrative, and difficulty is the tool an interactive art form has to modulate this tension. The Witness increases the cognitive load of its puzzles. Devil May Cry throws in additional enemies and harder bosses. Alien Isolation unlocks new layers of its AI behavior tree. And some, if not all of these games, use fail states to both tell you that you are not good enough to progress, and also manage the flow channel to keep you engaged. Yule called it the paradox of failure, when he claimed it strikes him as strange that we positively desire failure, despite actively trying to avoid it. He resolves this by using the aforementioned tragedy paradox, as well as some preliminary research into the fact that we have two sets of cognitive systems that can want different things simultaneously. However, the strange paradox of failure might have to do with how our culture views failure. In his book, What Games Teach Us About Learning, James Gee argues that we have been conditioned into viewing failure as bad because of how our schools work. We view it as a deficiency instead of an opportunity to learn, and that has to do with how perverse our conception of learning is. Failure is inherently an opportunity to learn, not a confirmation of our liabilities, and until we reinstitute play into our curriculums, this paradox might still persist. Games have some interesting ways of keeping people in the flow channel. Apart from letting gamers select the difficulty for themselves, some games have silent dynamic systems, like Resident Evil 4, or modulated based on ability like in God Hand. AI directors in Left 4 Dead and Alien Isolation actually monitor the tension felt by the player and adjust the difficulty accordingly, and a game like Celeste has an assist mode that lets players customize it in intricate detail. There are also more implicit ways of doing this. For example, choosing a mage character in Dark Souls is easier than playing a melee-based one, and asymmetrical games like Overwatch have roles that don't require precision but encourage cooperation. Other games have ingenious ways of incorporating death into a game's narrative. Prince of Persia is told as a recollection of past events, so if you die, the prince states that this isn't how the story goes. Shadow of Mordor makes you play a quasi-supernatural being, and acknowledges your death as part of its fiction. It then uses its nemesis system to craft an emergent tale around this, promoting the orc that felled you to a higher rank in the orc hierarchy, and setting up a procedural story about resurrection and revenge. Rogue Legacy makes you play as the descendant of every character that you die as, accepting your death as a part of an evolutionary narrative about the pooling of ancestral knowledge, until you triumph as one of your original hero's descendants, most likely a giant with lots of health. Difficult games have seen something of a renaissance of late, with Souls-likes, roguelikes, procedurally driven systems, and punishing fighting games all rising in popularity. Part of the allure might be the fact that as the medium matures and more gamers enter the fold, experiences are being catered to the broadest demographic, the casual audience, and so games are becoming more eager to hold a player's hands. This creates a niche for extremely difficult games to rise, and hence, Prepare to Die is actually an appealing statement. Challenge isn't the only thing games are about though. There are many other aesthetics of play that exist, from narrative to fantasy, sensory escapism, cooperation and expression. Challenge is at the heart of play, but like I said, games can be many things. The flow channel for beginning players is actually much lower in the totem pole, so the level of intensity long-time game players feel with Dark Souls can be provided for with the easy mode of other games. Much like how art can be about photorealistic representation, but also abstract concepts, impressionism or self-awareness, games can be about challenge, but also any number of other things. Once we view challenge as just another brushstroke in the repertoire of the game designer, perhaps we can get past the growing pains of difficulty in our medium. Invictus can be built into games through difficulty and tension modulation, and strangely enough, some argue this is actually what makes a game fun. Ralph Koster's book, A Theory of Fun, argues fun is a measure of the depth of a game, because play is about learning. So tic-tac-toe is less fun than Go, because it has a dominant solution and a sparser possibility space. Again, he is viewing fun through the lens of difficulty or cognitive strain, but this can also exist in the context of a narrative. I could say War and Peace is much more dense than a children's book, and hence is more fun in this particular vector. This broad conception of fun is useful, but also limited, so maybe the word engagement is better. Aaron Hofstadter's model of fun called Sophia is about the general mechanism of taking players from a state of uncertainty to a state of knowledge and competence. Whatever aesthetic of play or emotion is used to mediate this transformation. Uniting the idea of fun and engagement in games to the fail state gives us a better understanding of what death is in a game. It's something like impenetrable prose in a very difficult book you are reading that requires multiple layers of analysis. It's trying to put together what the hell is going on in the obscure world of Little Nightmares, or being a part of a community of lore hunters in Bloodborne, who are as obsessive as the scholars within the game are when it comes to figuring out the Lovecraftian abyss under the surface of reality. Invictus can be conveyed through the mechanics, like in the difficult puzzle platforming of Super Meat Boy. It can be conveyed through the narrative, like in the beautifully rendered psychological hellscape of Hellblade, where we witness the proliferation of patterns and disembodied voices through solving puzzles and binaural audio. Or it can be conveyed through both, like the recently released Celeste. Celeste is a fairly difficult platformer that built its narrative themes around Invictus. You play as Maddie, a listless and somewhat depressed young woman who has decided to climb a mountain, a metaphor for her inadequacies. She has periodic panic attacks and is confronted by her own shadow, reflecting the anxiety inherent in the mechanics of a difficult platformer in the narrative of the game. The game, much like Dark Souls, is heralded as a triumph in helping people overcome their depression, mostly because it is smart enough to acknowledge in its fiction what it is we are doing in any game to begin with. I don't want to spoil any of it, but Maddie's state of mind beautifully parallels your own psychological arc as you play the game, as frustration gives way to Fiero. It helps that the game's platforming is expertly crafted, giving a series of scaffolded challenges that rise incrementally across the game. It also has the aforementioned assist mode to aid players, just like Dark Souls allows you to level up and join in jolly cooperation. These games are telling us to conquer our demons, but they are also telling us that it's okay to ask for help when you feel overwhelmed. Again though, challenge does not need to be conceptualized along a single dimension of hard, either cognitively or dexterously. It can happen in the context of a narrative, and hence in the actions of your avatar. In his GDC talk, The Play of Stillness, Brian Upton argues that much of the interactivity of a game takes place in a player's head, and he argues for a dynamic called interpretive play. Interpretive play is much like what happens when you play PT, where the mechanics involved are just about walking through a hall, trying to piece together an obscure narrative. However, if you are like me, this is every bit as harrowing as a more mechanically intense game, or a survival horror game that has more, actual surviving. Like I said, play is a way to take forces in the real world and put them in a controllable context, and can be challenging and Invictus-inducing along many dimensions. Hellblade forces us to empathize with the plight of a schizophrenic, and not only does this give us an unparalleled insight into the mind of another, it feels harrowing for all the same reasons a difficult platformer does. Another brilliant thing the game does, and this is a minor spoiler, be warned, is tell the player that their progress will be reset after a certain number of deaths. This sounds like Dark Souls, except it was a lie. They were trying to simulate the paranoia and anxiety that many like Senua face on a daily basis, and they did this using a meta-narrative device that got the game a whole lot of negative publicity. We can even do simple things like just aligning the avatar with the player. In Uncharted 2's in medias res opening, he is confused, discombobulated, and upside down, just as we are. Another scene in Uncharted 3 illustrates this narrative form of Invictus as well. After you crash in the desert, you are left to roam for a while, as Nathan starts to hallucinate patterns, see mirages, and come face to face with his demons. At one point, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland starts playing as he looks for shade under a rock, and when he eventually finds sanctuary, he is confronted by enemies. We feel every bit as exhausted, thirsty, and overwhelmed as Nathan did in this section, despite the fact we weren't doing anything mechanically difficult. Now they could have done this better, perhaps by making you feel as directionless and lost as Nathan was, but you get the point. Games have much more than just conventional mechanical challenge to convey Invictus. In the game Bound, you play as a dancer in the subconscious of a woman who is trying to reconcile with the father who abandoned her. and this mechanically light traipse through a beautifully rendered cubic nightmare feels like a triumph of the will by the end. Flower has a section where Mother Nature's spiritual journey is interrupted by industrialization, and despite not being mechanically intense, it is mechanically restricting and foreboding, making you feel the peril of nature at the encroachment of humanity in mechanical ways. Fortunately, the end of that game is about the reconciliation of nature and humanity, an analog to Nelson Mandela if I ever heard it. Metal Gear Solid 4 spoilers ahead, but towards the end of that game, there is this scene where you are playing as an old, diseased and dying snake, crawling through a corridor with every expectation you might die. The fate of the world hangs in the balance, and the camera shifts between the various characters you are fighting for, as all hope seems to be dwindling. The game prompts you to rapidly tap the triangle button, a dreaded QuickTime event, except for some reason it works here. Seeing this battered shell of a once charismatic hero fight through this with our finger-prompted encouragement, despite all the cynicism he has, the hardship he has dealt with, and all without the recognition a hero of his caliber deserves, can't help but elicit that intangible sense of Invictus in us, the player. The Dylan Thomas poem tells us not to go gently into that good night, and this is at the core of Invictus, whether it be through mechanics, narrative, or a mix of the two. This is built into the language of games, and is what I think William Ernest Henley was trying to communicate to us from the prison that was his own body. At the Game Awards ceremony for Best Independent Game of the Year, the developers of Celeste had this to say, and I thought it perfectly captured what all this is about.
Here's one thing I want to say though. If Celeste has helped you come to terms with mental illness, I just want to say that you deserve credit for that. That change came from inside of you, and you're capable of a lot more. Thank you.